Hello and good evening, everybody. Welcome to this evening's In Focus event. This is part of an ongoing series of online talks and presentations by Street Level, helping us all stay connected to creative ideas and projects through these times. So I'm Isalt and I work at Street Level. I'm involved in developing the engagement and learning programme. And I'm really delighted this evening to be welcoming artist Sylvia Grace Borda. Hi, Sylvia.
Hi, good to be here.
Hi, and Christiane Monarchi, curator, lecturer, and artist mentor. Both of you, welcome. Thanks for joining us. So this event tonight coincides with the publication of the book Shifting Perspectives, which explores over 2 decades of Sylvia's work. The format for tonight will be that Sylvia is going to give us a presentation, and that'll be followed by a discussion with Christiane. And then we'll have time at the end for comments and questions from you. So please do give feedback during the presentations and discussions, and also add any of the questions that you have for the presenters tonight into the chat, and I will come back at the end and we'll save time for some of those. So Christiane Monarchi is the founding member of Photomonitor, an online magazine dedicated to photography and lens-based media. One of the very few magazines, it has to be said, that is really inclusive in its contents in relation to geographical reach. If it's something that you don't know, you must check it out online. It's a really astounding resource for all things photo and lens based visually, and also in relation to critical thinking. Sylvia's work has been featured several times in the magazine, and in the January issue it included a special feature on the book that we're celebrating here today. Christiane is also a freelance curator, lecturer and artist mentor, and she currently serves on the board of Photo Fusion in London. She's on the steering committee of Fast Forward Women in Photography, and is a trustee of the Hyman Foundation. In 2020, she co-founded Hapax magazine, a new publication which commissions photographic artists and curators to make new work specifically for publication. Christiane, thanks again so much for agreeing to bring your insight and your overview to today's discussion. So let me just give a brief introduction, because Christiane's really going to do a lot of the dialogue in this respect, but a brief introduction to Sylvia Grace Borda. She's a Canadian-British photographer, artist, and social innovator. Sylvia has undertaken some incredible projects which engage with and reimagine urban spaces. The new towns of East Kilbride and Glenrothes in Scotland, modernist faith buildings in Northern Ireland, and every bus stop in Surrey, British Columbia, but a few of the phenomenal projects she's engaged with and feature in this book. Sylvia is a member of a growing field of artists tackling cultural policy through the visual arts. She's a sought after and respected voice at the forefront of culture-led, socio-economic and community development projects in Canada and the UK. She's worked nationally and internationally in senior roles in the creative and cultural industries for over 17 years. Her exhibition, Camera Histories, was first exhibited in Street Level in 2013, and in the same year she exhibited as part of the multi-venue Blueprint exhibition with us also. So really great to have you involved in this respect, Sylvia. She's acknowledged for her work at the forefront of culture-led and socially engaged community practice. Her pioneering media artworks have been recognised over the last decade, including winning the Lumen Prize for Achievement in Web Arts in 2016, and being recognised for embedding dimensional portraits in Google Street View. With long-term bodies of work, Sylvia brings her sharp and detailed knowledge of cultural, social and photographic history to everything she does, alongside a deep probing of her subject. With persistent determination and rigour, she seeks to give voice and representation to the underrepresented and marginalised. In her project, Every Bus Stop in Surrey, she made over 14,000 images of bus stops. In her EK Modernism project in East Kilbride, she made over 8,000 images of the town. And in her project, this one for the farmers, Sylvia has brought attention to the very overlooked area of food production and the people that work the land, something which over the last year has really come more into the forefront of global discussions. I want to just finish up with my little introduction, quoting a tiny bit from Ron Tamis and his family from the book, who were one of the farming families that Sylvia collaborated with. He says, Sylvia taught us there's no reason why we shouldn't challenge how family farming is looked upon by societies. Her refusal to give up has given us a platform and hope. Hope is something that evolves through creation and action. Once there is hope, it becomes contagious and assists in others moving forward to create more positive outcomes for their communities. And I think that's a really perfect introductory note. And on the food theme, all I can say is that if tonight's event was a meal, we have the very finest of ingredients, and combined, they promise an hour of creative inspiration packed with intellectual punch, and for sure, some rocket fuel for your cerebral nourishment. So it's a really great pleasure to hand over to you, Sylvia. Please take it away.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate that. Just keep in mind, I am a person. That bio was extraordinary, so thank you so much. But as mentioned, I'm going to go towards a presentation. So let me start that right away. And that will walk through everybody in terms of some of the ideas presented in the book and in terms of the way that I process and think about space. Firstly, I should acknowledge that I am in Vancouver. I'm born and raised here and a dual citizen with British Canadian status. And it's always quite important to recognize where you've come from and how that sort of impacts how you think and how you move forward in things. And so I'd like to do a land acknowledgement by saying that I'm here within Vancouver and I'm acknowledging the traditional landowners. And I'd like to pay my respect to the BC Coast Salish elders past and future and to the next generation. Specifically, this talk is being presented on the unceded and traditional territories of the Coast Salish peoples, including the Squamish, Stolo, Tsleil-Waututh, and Musqueam nations. I'll also be looking in mid-presentation at the city of Surrey, BC, which is also part of the unceded and traditional territories of the Salish people, in particular the Stolo, Kwantlen, Maskwi, Katsi, Tawasin, and Samihu nations, whose historical and ancestral relationships with the land continue to this day. So how and where do projects begin? Well, they begin in context, what you've learned, what you've seen, what you've experienced, how you've been educated. And so this takes me to the context of being a student of photo practice and a student of photo histories. I've always been really fascinated by the works of Mission Héliographique. And this was a commission put together in the 1850s by the French government of 5 key photographers, Henri Lassac, Mostral, Hippolyte Bayard, Gustave Legray, and Borda. These were all photographers that were commissioned to go out into the French countryside and to find buildings that were potentially needing restoration, or were under threat of complete ruination and disappearing from the land. And in this way, in looking at these images, I became well aware of the fact that there was these epic projects that had been done by photographers to map their landscape, in this case, an urban scape through the buildings that were documented. And it just gives you just a sense or flavor of some of those images that were accomplished during the time of Mission Héliographique. And later in that sort of post period, so we're looking at the 1850s, moving towards the 1870s, another moment happened in French photography where Charles Marville became assigned the official photographer of Paris, looking at Paris as it progressed forward from Philip Halsman's reconstruction of the city towards a more modernized Paris that we would know today. And he focused a lot on the technologies that were present, sometimes the lamps, the lighting structures, sometimes the boulevards, the glass arcades. And so there was this kind of awareness of all of this imagery, and awareness that there were these larger urban endeavors that had happened at the onset of photography, but had sort of gotten lost or missed. Struck me, particularly when I came to East Kilbride vis-a-vis a commission, is that wouldn't it be interesting as a photographer to walk the landscape as a mission heliographic photographer? Could I go through East Kilbride, Scotland's first new town, designed in the 40s and sort of built in the 50s up towards the 70s and the end of the East Kilbride Town Corporation by the 80s? Could I document what was present and what would I see? And in particular, there was certainly an urgency when I started this project in 2004, because there was a Scottish initiative that had begun, which was also about the regeneration of particular areas within the different council districts. So South Lanarkshire looked at East Kilbride and was about to regenerate, or in this case, demolish all the secondary and primary schools. And I saw these as in particularly really interesting zones in which you would be looking towards the concept of, how shall I say, architects and groups that had contributed significantly. We're having these images being produced. So as Isel mentioned as part of the beginning, there was a rapid archive that I was creating, and this endeavor wasn't happening overnight. This was going to be a 3-4 year relationship with East Kilbride, starting in 2004, an intensive period between 2004 to 2007, and going as late as 2010. So I was there documenting a number of the schools, particularly under this modernization program that was going to create erasure of some of the key modernist buildings. One of them was Duncanrig, which sat close to the town centre, designed by Sir Basil Spence, a key Scottish modernist architect. So there was this kind of mechanism that I was walking through the town, almost like a flaneur, but also in the spirit of mission heliographique. Could I go and understand the makeup of the city? Could I go and see what was present within the area? And could I create a sort of a conceptual process? Could I make the town into my own artwork by documenting it in detail? So this is just a sampling of some of the images that were present, and it did lead to a significant body of work within a 1 year period. And through that, rather than going towards simply a public exhibition, there was an opportunity to publish a book. So EK Modernism became this artist book that I published, and it was a way to distribute what I had seen and experienced throughout East Kilbride, something that would move beyond the limits of the former new town of East Kilbride. And within this, there were a series of essays, both by artists and also architectural historians, that gave a bit of a more rounded approach to how to understand, to interpret East Kilbride in terms of its modernist histories and in terms of its modernist future. I also decided within that kind of process, it's a strategy that I tend to work with, is how can you also reach the broadest audience? And typically, new towns within Scotland aren't always looked at as favorable areas. They have won everything from the Carbuncle Prize for worst places to live, such as like Glenrothes, to being considered sort of secondary in terms of the mindset of where histories lie. And so what I wanted to do was also to give access to people who maybe weren't from Scotland to also explore East Kilbride through my photographs. And this was done by actually producing a very large website known as eknewtown.com. Unfortunately, it's come to an end this year, not through lack of wanting to let it continue, but the plugin that was running this platform, which was written in Flash, has come to end on the web platforms that are available. So within this kind of arena, we had an ability that you could see all the different districts within East Kilbride. And if you were to go to a particular zone, College Milton, Peel Park, Haremyres, or anything that was present, you could see a number of images that would push you through that neighborhood. You could also go to individual streets, and this would also enable you to explore the new town vis-a-vis an artistic lens. The interface also included a series of essays: what's the new town, what to look for, what were the principles behind it, what to know about East Kilbride, where there were new trends, and more about this project. So it was sort of a multi-layered kiosk format that was this hybrid of almost Google Street View plus a cultural museum lens on top of it. So it was quite a dense site. And to give you a sense that if you went towards Duncanrig, which is the school front that we just saw in an earlier slide, you would come to a pop-up like this. And so what happened is that you would be able to move through a slideshow that would take you through a number of images of the school, and you would also get a series of statements that would come to help contextualize what you were seeing. And you would close your button and you'd return to the interface, and you could sort of push through all these locations to understand the principles behind what this new town looked like. And in some ways it was quite interesting, because East Kilbride was designed where it wasn't one building was designed in sort of as a monument to modernism. It was that the entire fabric of this former new town created a holistic whole. And that was something that you could start to see by exploring all these interfaces and these pop-up windows, that each district had key gems or architectural urban buildings, but it also had key passageways. And as the remodernization program was happening, this would come to an end. So I wanted to document that and make that visible to the public. Within that, places like Rhizome, which is a New York entity that reviews everything to do with technology and the arts, started to put together a review. And I could never prove this, but this review, plus the one that happened for every bus stop in Surrey, BC, which was also an online map where you could start to explore districts, I always had the inkling, gave the folks back in Silicon Valley or at Google a sense of mapping cartography, and this idea that you could push through environments and let people see the street as it lay. And so this is actually pre-prototype Google Street View, these two projects, both every bus stop in Surrey, BC, and East Kilbride, or EK Newtown. Whoops, we'll keep going on. So nevertheless, what happened with EK Newtown and what happened with EK modernism is that it really started to ignite imagination. And so the folks at Canadian Architect picked up an article calling it Border Crossings, looking at how I saw and mapped the town, and started to understand that photographs could effectively form not only simultaneously a contemporary artwork, but they could also quickly form an archive of architecture and the built and urban environment. So this philosophy of a project being both conceptual and rationalized as an archive of the present, but could also fit in due course into the past and into the future, became really quite interesting. And likewise, I was very fortunate that the Herald picked up an article in 2006 towards the end of the year, looking at, because I proclaimed not only was EK this subject that I had photographed, or East Kilbride was this area that I had photographed, I made this conceptual statement that East Kilbride was my artwork, that I was annexing the whole town as part of an artistic work that I had published. And of course, this created controversy. This was not something that was without a lot of feedback. My sister was working in London, and a lot of Scots had heard of this article that were living down south. And she got certainly heckled about my idea that a new town was even worthy to think of photographic documentation, let alone preservation. But that's exactly what a good photo project can do, is it doesn't necessarily need to stand in the way of progress, but what it can do is offer an alternative to think about the space and assign other values to it. So this article was quite seminal, and for dialogue with colleagues back in Canada, I passed on an article to Scott Watson, who is curator at the Helen Morris Belkin Art Gallery as part of the University of British Columbia. And he read this article and he said, you know, we would really like to collect EK modernism. We'd like to see it part of the body of work that is housed at the art gallery at the university. And so it was with some serendipity that a crossover also started to happen between Canada and Scotland. Probably unbeknownst to a lot of Scots, is that this project was first collected in Canada. And you can go effectively to the Belkin Gallery collection and see a number of the materials that were donated to the gallery for its collection and study. Likewise, in 2017, a key exhibition was put together called Sites of Assembly, curated by Gabby Mosser and Lorna Brown. And I was really taken aback. This image doesn't really show the scale, but this poster is effectively about 3.5 meters by 6 meters. This massive mural also appeared on the side of the Belkin Gallery, not only promoting the show in which EK Modernism profiled, but also seeing this as a point of discussion to look at how archives photography and the dialogue of the built environment and how things are stored, reconsidered, and debated. EK Modernism was considered a big part of that debate. So projects kind of grow and they move in ways that you don't anticipate. So having completed EK Modernism and being still really interested in the development of the former new towns in Scotland, I went to Scotland's second new town, Glenrothes. But I went and visited it with a very different lens, and that being a new topographic photographer, somebody interested in the margins of the suburban. And in particular, I was thinking of William Eggleston's Guide. This was a book that he published. It was also one of the first color photographic publications that the Met put together. And he photographed suburbia in terms of its placement of urban architecture and the traces of life that happen within that platform. So what we see here is sort of an image from that series, and me taking this on board. A holiday in Glenrothes sort of started with this idea of the camper van. This is Glenrothes, just outside of in the Fife area. So I started to explore the city in terms of a new topographic photographer. This is a history that doesn't exist in Scotland. Taking and transplanting an American movement elsewhere would seem to come with some sort of folly. But as a Canadian trained in a longer or in a different type of photographic history, it made sense to attempt something that Scots wouldn't. And so I wanted to show that there could be value in what resides in someone's own backyard. That in fact, these areas that were seen as outspills for larger urban development to Glasgow or to Edinburgh and so on, could be areas themselves that had cultural value and worth. And so as a new topographic photographer, with this in mind, I explored Glenrothes. I looked at its parks, I looked at its public art settings. I went everywhere to capture these views where color photography, much like Stephen Shore or Eggleston, I took on their vocabulary and style and supplanted it into this sort of Scots environment. And so you came up with these images that had their own beauty, composition, and that were of a particular location. And I was also very fortunate that a lot of dialogue started to happen about this different way of seeing and operating in terms of a color photographic practice within Scotland. And some of the support came from also tangents that you might not anticipate. So the Scottish Civic Trust asked me to develop curriculum about a holiday in Glenrothes for secondary students to learn how to photograph their own communities. And so I was really pleased to take that on, and that's became an exhibition that the Lighthouse supported and also supported an ongoing learning series that they were doing called, goodness, I've lost it. So the Scottish Civic Trust took that on board with a My Place photographic competition that they had run for several years, and a holiday in Glenrothes became a bit of a pivotal point for that as well in terms of learning and education outreach. Likewise, the Lighthouse and Architectural Design Scotland was starting to do a number of series of works looking at the presence of Scotland in Venice for the Scottish Architectural Biennale and its collateral pavilion. And I was invited to speak about EK Modernism and look at the value of how a photographic project could create vocabulary and different ways of seeing the built environment, both in terms of a platform for the arts and both in terms of a different way of seeing the built environment in a local capacity. I'm quite pleased to say that also this body of work, EK Modernism, was just recently acquired by the National Gallery's selection. And likewise, both EK Modernism and On Holiday in Glenrothes are part of the University of St. Andrews special collections. So if you're interested in seeing those bodies of work, you could go explore them in greater detail through those two locations. So as artists come and evolve in time, they also start looking at the environment in a much more broader capacity. And this was true in terms of what I was aware of in Histories of Photography. So Mission Hélographique was the urban environment, and Eugène Auger could also be seen as part of the urban environment documenting Paris in its transitional period. But there's a body of work that sort of goes astray, which is Eugène Auger photographed a number of orchards that were under threat as Paris continued its development. And so this is just an example of that. And I was also, as projects came and went, I spent time as a lecturer in Belfast in Northern Ireland. And I started looking at the landscape in terms of what was around Armagh. And there is a very well-known set of orchard areas where Bramley apples are grown. And so I started to get interested in the landscape of another way of representing a locale, not through, let's say, the troubles, but through something that could be much more subtle. So I started to do these series of orchards, looking at heritage apple orchards. So these are plantings that happened 60, 80 years ago, and how trees were pruned, cut, and managed from one generation to the next. So this body of work started to percolate, but I also was taking on board that I was sort of seeing and reading things very differently. And so I was very fortunate to be traveling between Belfast and Scotland and visiting the national galleries on the Mound, the main galleries. There's great impressionist paintings that are included, including this one that the gallery owns, Claude Monet, Poplars on the River Ypres. And what I loved about this was the didactic label. Claude Monet had used a technology, and a technology that we don't tend to think about because what we see and we understand is the process of painting. But Claude Monet had actually used a studio boat. He had gone through the process of using a tool not associated with his trade or craft in order to get another perspective. So he's literally painting this view from being in the middle of the river. And he also did something that is quite extraordinary. And I love the didactic that the National Galleries had for this because it offered another view, another way to understand this painting, which is Claude Monet worked and negotiated with the timber merchants that owned all these poplars because the trees were supposed to be harvested. And so what he did is he bought a certain amount of time, I think something like 6 months, that the trees wouldn't be harvested so he could finish this artwork. And that struck me. Could an artist start to have a relationship with others in the most unexpected way? And so I started to go out vis-a-vis the work I had done in Northern Ireland, back home in the Metro Vancouver area. The easiest areas to access that still have the sort of suburban rural agricultural margins attached to them are associated with the city of Surrey. And so I started talking to farmers in Surrey, looking at, could I possibly work with them to start portraying landscape in the most unexpected ways? I would consult with them heavily in terms of trying to understand farming culture and represent it in a way that was meaningful for farmers. But I would also try and put it in a contemporary frame where it could be conceptual or it could speak to a wider contemporary body. And this became these diptych videos as well as photographic bodies of work that were created. So this was done, this left plane comes from aerial views, a video artwork that was produced using a drone. And what I wanted to do is I recognized that looking at that picture of Eugène Auger, the camera was fixed to the ground. Typically, the camera is always at the level of the photographer. It's at this eye level. There can be a certain amount of staging to get some sort of height and distance, but what would it be like to be an artist where the camera was now skimming a landscape, where the camera was taking on a different perspective? This work started in 2011 and 12. It was done in collaboration with a good friend, Reiner Derdau. We bought a drone. So these are early days of drone. This thing's really quite bulky in relationship to what's on the market currently. And we couldn't afford effectively any further software or tools to have a callback or to see the images that we were creating. And so I love this idea that the camera could be like Monet's paintbrush. It would skim and paint across the landscape. So I was quite interested in moving the camera and juxtaposing it often on the right-hand plane with a still image or an image that was taken at ground level. So you would see these two contrasting planes together. And again, you could almost call this a love letter to Scotland to a certain degree. The Scottish museum collections have been very informative, and they've really kind of helped position my own practice. It's been brilliant to see things. So Chardin's image of a cellar boy or a scullery maid that are held at the Hunterian Art Gallery offer this idea of looking at the representation of labor. So these are 18th century images, also knowing that there are sort of 19th century images of Camille Corot, for instance, you know, the pastoral landscape with farmers present, but recognizing that there's been this sort of passage in time where farmers appeared in the 19th century, sort of doing this hand-based work. There's a few images of August Sanders moving forward, showing farmers working the land. Another example, but there wasn't really contemporaneous images within our own time frame. And so what I thought I would do is I would go back to this early history of painting, or I should say 19th century painting, where the farmer was certainly a subject, and I would bring back the camera and a photographic vision of looking at farming practice. And a lot of colleagues in Vancouver said, effectively, I've lost my mind. Farming is a dangerous subject. It's not something we do over here. You know, how are you going to do this? Isn't it just going to look like something else? Isn't it going to sort of push itself into reportage? And I said, no, I think there's a very different way of doing it. And I was fortunate enough when I was in Belfast to meet John M. Lynch. He was a Google trusted photographer, meaning he was someone that was going in to photograph businesses and give them this sort of 360 treatment. So you could go onto Street View, you could click along, and if there was a tab, you could click the tab and you could also get a 360 walkthrough of that particular business. And so I spoke to John on and off. And so this idea of surveillance or using a drone was certainly informed by my time in Northern Ireland. Also, my time in Northern Ireland gave me this opportunity to really start to understand some of the principles behind Google Street View. And I have to say, thanks to John Lynch for taking this on board. He gave me a good set of tools in which we could go forward collaboratively to produce something that was titled Farm Tableau. And so what we would do is we were going to create the first dimensional photographs or the first portraits of people within Google Street View. Typically, photographers have downloaded from the Google Street View engine, almost like glitch art. They find things that have gone astray or that are missing, and that becomes something that they frame and they download from the interface. But I wanted to put something into Google. In a way, I was probably looking towards the fact that with every bus stop in Surrey, BC, and EK Modernism, I had created these pre-Google Street View interfaces. And, you know, it would be lovely if Street View or Google had come back and said, you know, give us your artistic sort of ideas or let's collaborate together. Instead, they created an entire mapping system. And so in a sneaky way, I was a bit determined to insert something back into Google Street View. And so John, brilliant, well-known established Google Street View photographer, was up for the challenge. I didn't ask a Google Canadian photographer to take this on because I was worried that they would lose their license. And this is where John was very generous. He came to Canada, he came to Surrey, BC, and we started working within farms to create these portraits. So what you see here is a staging of Kevin Boyce in the turkey barn, preparing the water feeders, and John's getting together and ready to start doing these 360 views. So what happens is you can enter the the turkey barn, and you can start to actually move forward and around, and you can see the entire enterprise of the barn and the turkeys themselves. And I love the fact that there was also this ghosting that was happening. These were very long exposures. There was no way to keep the sort of turkeys still, but it spoke to early photography, where we were deconstructing Google. We were asking people to stand still for 40 minutes. So as the camera moved closer and away, it appeared that we could let space move into this sort of one moment that was collapsed in time. You could move in Google Street View when it was alive online, and it would appear that you were seeing this thing in one moment. Whereas in fact, the whole staging or all these tableaus had taken hours. And in fact, the people that were also portrayed had stood in place for long extended periods of time. So these just give you a sample of some of these images that came from Farm Tableau. This is Byrne, who was in her 80s, working away at her rhododendron garden and sales. Her son-in-law, Chris. And what's also fascinating is, yes, these are images that are presented that very much look in the form of portraiture, but all the Google interface is left behind. Likewise, here is Pam Tamas from Rondriso Farms preparing the accounts within the farm store. So there was this opportunity to bring farmers to the forefront in a way that was unanticipated, and to let them be a subject for the camera at the same point where they had almost disappeared. So with the advent of photography, you could say, and the momentum it gained in the 1850s and 60s and onwards, the farmer as a subject slowly sort of receded into the background. So I wanted to bring the farmer back into the photographic frame. I also had a bit of a difficulty, which is that when you're working in a medium that no one's worked in before, in the sense that you're inserting an artwork within it, you have the potential that no one might realize that this is an artwork. And so the only way I could seam around this, and I worked with John on this, is to create a series of self-portraits. So I would be always about 800 meters away from the main sort of scenes of labor and so on, but that you would have this opportunity somewhere to find me behind a camera. And this was done so I couldn't be blurred out. And this was an obligation that John had as a Google Street View photographer, is everybody's face had to be blurred. But if I could hide behind the technology I was working within, I was left sort of a little bit more, I was given some sort of amnesty towards the Google Street View blur system. So what you have here is this portrait of me on the Metamist farms, the turkey farms. And this is an image that appears in an essay that Liz Wells wrote for the essay. And on the next page, I write a mirroring essay to it. There's this image. And what I also wanted to do within the Google Street View is to sometimes not only show myself behind the apparatus, the camera, but also to show that there was the Google camera present. So if you want, there's this opportunity to download Liz Wells' essay and to see both these sort of page layouts that almost acted as a bookend, but also as this sort of flip book scenario that you're seeing the end of one essay and then you're seeing the beginning of the other. Liz Wells also wrote a really apt essay where she called the work I was doing about shifting perspectives. And that's the title that the book bears, is from Liz's essay. But it was also, it really is an ethos that I try and work closely to, is how do you change not only the audience, the content, the community, the collaboration, the efforts behind it, but how do you create it in a very layered and meaningful way? So Google Street View sort of also led to other endeavors. And I have to say, I also felt a little bit like Hippolyte Bayard's, that, Portrait of a Brown Man. This was the first conceptual act or staging within Google Street View. There was ever opportunity that Google could take out these images. So my sort of faraway portrait here could certainly be erased. And there's no doubt that as time has gone on, some of these Street View farm portraits have disappeared. And so in some cases have my own portrait within the engine. So there's this kind of moment of thinking of Hippolyte Bayard, Portrait of a Brown Man, a conceptual act, and would anyone take note? And so I was really happy and pleased and ecstatic, because when you're working in a way that is so different from other mechanisms, you need a platform. You need people to speak, talk, and hopefully discuss the work. And the concept of a dimensional photograph is a term that I had to put forward in order for people to understand what I was talking about. Because when it comes to Google Street View, there's not really a lot of vocabulary around it other than you download or it's a panospheric image. So in Vancouver, the Tyee did a wonderful article looking at the Google Farm View. A set of UK magazines put together online articles saying photographers create first artworks in Google Street View. Photomonitor did a brilliant article looking at work I was doing in Finland that continued this on. And of course, the Lumen Prize had in 2016 a phenomenal opportunity where you could submit work that looked at net art. And so I really wanted this to go forward and at least to be talked or discussed as a platform that hadn't existed before, and was thrilled to win the Lumen Prize in 2016. So these things helped bring some gravitas to the endeavor. I was also very fortunate that Street Level put together an exhibition that I had proposed called Camera Histories. And within it, I looked at cameras past, present, and future. And in this case, Google Street View is sort of this future. And Street Level hosted the imagery or the 5 Google Street View farm tableaus within its own website that you could also view. So they created this platform that you could see the material in its native platform, which was thrilling. But within Camera Histories, I started also to be exploring this idea of the malleable photograph. And this is something that we tend to lose, which is this idea of collage and montage, or what I would call the digital ready-made. Lots of sites like eBay, Craigslist, Gumtree put together images that are made by amateur photographers, often sellers wanting to either dispose of assets or trying to move their craft wares. And so I started to collect this ephemera, this digital ephemera online, that knowing it would get disposed of quite quickly. As an item got sold, that image would certainly disappear and it would hit someone's mobile phone into the trash. There was no further need for it. So Cameras and Watercolor Sunsets was about taking the photograph or downloading images of watercolor sunsets, this sort of representation of a watercolor on another platform through digital photography, and also working with these images of cameras, mostly in this case, film cameras for sale. Some people were trying to show scale of the camera, other people were trying to show the camera, its back and verso and so on, because they simply didn't know what a film camera was like. So it was quite interesting to see how people were handling the imagery of cameras for sale. But Cameras and Watercolor Sunsets was this digital ready-made, sort of almost the Duchamp moment now for a digital platform, taking 2 images that were available through social networked channels, bringing them together and creating a new composition. And the lens of the camera effectively is always where the sunset is located. And these are just a sampling of images that come from the Cameras and Watercolor Sunset series. Began in 2009. It's kind of my dual system. I make them to this day. These ones were just produced over the last couple of months. And it's probably a bit pandemic inspired because they're all sort of cameras on holiday, as you could call. They're all at a beachfront. So Cameras and Watercolor Sunset was about the digital malleability. Did the photographer have to be the photographer or the artist? Could I annex these images and call them my own and author them under a different title and guise? So that series worked on that way. I was always looking at also ideas of negatives and of, we've come so far from the advent of photography, we're 180 years on plus, that a lot of us are able to read a negative, that seeing technologies would be often about images produced as photographic image negatives, and yet you could see positives, you could see other things within them. We could start to allow the public to read photography through a very different means in terms of what was compositionally present. And this concept of the negative really was something that I've always been, closely aligned to through understanding photographic earlier practices like the photogram. You put an object on a piece of paper, it's exposed to light for a certain amount of time, you remove it, and it leaves a tracing or shadow of itself. So Anna Atkins, key British photographer in the 1850s, using Herschel's cyanotype process to publish the first books that are botanical overviews to different parts, whether they were algae or ferns, things that were native to the British Isles. So thinking about Anna Atkins' photogram process and early photography and this concept of the negative or this image that's left behind, when I'm stuck on a project, when I'm stuck, I usually make photograms. I take things in the local environment and they get sort of compressed, put behind glass, and a sequence of images are made to document the vicinity that I'm within. An invitation came from SSW, or the Scottish Sculptural Workshop in Lumsden, so this is North Scotland or Aberdeenshire, to come together and under Frontiers in Retreat to put together a series of ecological artworks. And so these photograms were sort of this interim process of me trying to learn and think about the area that I was within. And I had this idea that I wanted to do something for the community that would explore ecologies, but would also explore photographic practice. And the concept of the Lumsden biscuit sort of had a happy moment that I was making these photograms and I was thinking of something that was a little bit unexpected. And it can be seen really here in this upper tier. I was constantly trying to make sculptural molds in order to cast certain things. So here we see a cast of a pine cone. And what arose is that I was having high failure. The materials were great, but the castings, which are these negatives, weren't always going the way I had expected. These aluminum molds were quite heavy, and I was trying to create these beautiful shortbread molds. And in discussions with different sculptors and a colleague of mine, John Keith Donnelly, I started to realize I could make shortbread molds not just in metal, but in wood. And I could start to play with the true sort of mechanism behind a Scottish shortbread mold. We could carve them to a certain depth, like an old Scottish shortbread mold, and we could output new shortbreads. And these shortbreads would be about the local ecology. They would be based on the photogram, and we would effectively make the first photogrammed biscuit available. And this was done all with community input. So young people came forward, traditional bakers from the town came, and we all worked together to make the Lumsden biscuit something that was particular to the geography and that could give the community a new tool and way of speaking about its landscape. And that was quite significant when one thinks that in Huntly, there's a well-known shortbread bakery down the way, that we could make these bespoke biscuits that could have another way of seeing and thinking about the environment, as well as early photography. Lastly, this concept of the trompe l'oeil, that you see something, that you understand it's painted, but yet there's this temptation that it has this 3D modeling that you might be able to pick up one of these items. Another fantastic artwork housed at the Hunterian Art Gallery. And so you're always having this crisscross of myself as a photographer in landscape, in dialogue with communities, and also being sort of a museum junkie, going to see things. And I love simulacra, I love seeing optical things. And this picture always stuck with me, which is, what could I do in the future? Could I do something that was a bit different? And so when Shifting Perspectives came forward as a book publication, it came to mind that I could create a rendering that would be very different. I could also create the very first literary publication placed within Google Street View. It would be my own book title, Shifting Perspectives, which has been co-produced by the Surrey Art Gallery and Heritage House Press in Victoria, BC. And I could place it within this larger Google Street View environment. And you could see this as a still photo, but you could also interact with it. So what happens is, this is the title page or the inner title page of the book. And if you use the URL that's associated, you can actually see it as this dynamic Google Street View literary artwork. So I will leave it here and I'll go on to some questions. This is a bit of a brief overview, but it gives some of the philosophies behind projects that were happening in Scotland over the last decade that I've been working on. There's lots of overlaps with other locations, and there's other ways certainly to integrate processes that I've experienced both in Latvia, Finland, and in Northern Ireland that I can speak to as well.
Oh, thank you so much, Sylvia. That was amazing. I'm already thinking of 9 million ways to sort all the data that we've just heard about all your various projects, from biscuits to Google Street View and modernism and urban planning. What can I just say? You've been very busy since the last time we spoke 8 years ago. So it's amazing to be able to speak to you again tonight. Could I just start out by reiterating something we heard at the beginning, which I think is really important, and it's really hit home hearing you talk about your various projects, that you are an artist tackling cultural policy through the visual arts. So we're here under the umbrella of Street Level, thank you. And having had your exhibition there of prints, thinking about photography, you use photography as a tool in scientific and societal engagement to make sense of the world we're in. And it's very interesting to think about all the different ways that you celebrate overlooked places, overlooked people, perhaps farmers, ways of working, urban, and then also picking out the transnational similarities from your travels and from your different projects. It's almost like you're making a world map yourself.
I'd say it's really in collaboration with communities. I mean, I think the most important thing, and this I really understood when I went and assumed a senior teaching role at Queen's University Belfast, is it's important to know where you are in respect for the photographers that are present and in respect for the landscape. So I didn't want to come in as, okay, I've trained under the skies of the Vancouver School of Art, conceptual photography is the only way forward. You really wanted to embrace all the vocabularies and to ensure that particularly a student pool had a choice of what they could select as part of their own toolbox to go forward. So I think that's what I see my role as a contemporary photographer is to use my own experiences and my own photographic knowledge or histories and say, okay, what can we do together?
Well, I think on that note, I mean, when I look at your EK and Modernism book, which I have as well, and I was reading it again, and I noticed that there are no people in it. Obviously this is a book about the urban planning itself, and the people who live and think about this are not photographed in here, and it has a totally different reading now in 2021 and 2020, a city without people. Thinking about where the people come back in, you are engaging with centuries of thought about how we live better. And I just wanted to think about, what is your next collaboration going to look like in terms of how you study that through the lens of photography, whether it's going to be, are you moving back into farming concerns perhaps, or are you looking at a new geography or a different way of looking at how we live? Because it's very interesting that when you photograph something that's very commonplace, and I'm sure I read this in one of the essays, very good essays, that when you photograph something, it makes it extraordinary. And I think we've all been feeling that in the past year when we are in our lockdown or taking our little half-mile loud walks, looking at the same daisy or whatever, that the thing that you all of a sudden becomes beautiful, the thing that you have, the commonplace becomes extraordinary. But you've been doing this for decades now. So I just wanted to see what's next for you.
Well, I think you hit it. It's a bit of an unusual practice because there's no doubt that in Vancouver, my practice would be considered too sincere. And that's a really interesting thing, because I believe that it's really important to be generous, that generosity is a process onto its own that can create value, audience, engagement, and it also can transfer ownership. So what I didn't mention with the Lumsden biscuits is that I gave the molds to the community. And so to this day, the community actually still has the potential to produce a Lumsden biscuit. And I kind of liked it in the sense that we talk about social networked images. This is a social network biscuit. If you want a Lumsden biscuit, you have to know someone in Lumsden to get the biscuit. But the community itself is also open to ship the biscuit throughout Scotland and globally. So if you want to see the first photogram biscuit, if you want to have this open multiple, almost like a Felix Gonzalez Torres, you want to have the experience to take away something, there's this possibility. And I think that's often the more interesting part, or the latitude, is to look towards things where they're sharing. So a lot of projects, I guess you could say, tackled an early sharing economy, which I hadn't really thought about. So EK Newtown, how do you share a place that not anybody might visit? Holiday in Glenrothes, how can you take a little bit of humor to a new town that had won the Carbuncle Prize, as the worst place to live in Scotland, supposedly it had been nominated. How could you sort of change gears so that there was this other way forward? I will do a quick slide share that will give you a sense of where projects are next going. And it complicates, or it opens the dialogue from a Canadian perspective, because when I'm a Canadian, and I'm born and raised in Canada, so my first inclination is from what I've experienced in my youth and through my university life in Canada. As I say, I've hopefully used it respectfully elsewhere, because I'm this hybrid, but it's how do you also look where you're located. And so I spoke about this land territory acknowledgement at the beginning. And this is where the new work is starting to go. And it's a difficult piece. I have to be honest with you, I'm still grappling with it because it's very hard to even find the vocabulary. The materials and processes are very historic, but the concepts behind it are very relevant to today. So here we go. I'll just do a slide share, and hopefully the right slide deck.
Well, while you're doing that, can I just can I share a cute little anecdote that I read about why you were even in East Kilbride? Because I kind of thought about that a while ago. That what was this Canadian doing in this project here? And then you made this comment that said 4.5 million people, over half of the country, left in the 50s for Canada. So you might expect one Canadian back in exchange.
Yes, exactly. Very true.
I loved, and then I didn't appreciate how linked Canada and Scotland had been in terms of migration. So that's fascinating that you found so many crossovers. So what are we looking at here?
So what we're looking at here is a new body of work that's been really taking place over the last 8 months. And it sort of it continues from the work that was done at under the Frontiers umbrella at the Scottish Sculptural Workshop, or SSW, continuing with the photograms, continuing with the idea of the negative. And I was so fascinated that in sculptural molding, the process to get towards a positive, or to get towards a cast or a statue, is the negative. Same exactly as in photography. And so what I started to realize is what I had done at SSW is that small plant samplings from the local area had been clipped. Poor plant had been sacrificed, brought into the makeshift darkroom, and an image made. And I wanted to see, and it was a huge challenge, could I make a living plant into a negative? So what I started to do was I started to wrap a number of large heritage apple trees with cyanotype drapes or canvas. So light sensitive material that can only be exposed by UV, and the tree is acting as the negative, or is enabling this object to come through. And these things are huge in scale. We're looking at 1 meter by 3, 3 meters by 5, and so on. So there's this tremendous scale to this imagery that you don't anticipate. And it shows, the plant at one moment in its growth cycle. And it became kind of
very ephemeral. So it's really a few minutes exposure, or is it a longer exposure?
Oh no, I wish it was a few minutes. You're trying to drape this tree, trying to figure out its focus, because you're trying to deal with also a focal length issue. Literally, things have to be very close to the plant surface. A good photogram takes about 20 to 30 minutes, and it's contingent on your latitude and longitude. We're not as far north as Scotland, Vancouver is probably similar to London, but effectively, when you come to midsummer or late summer into early autumn, when the apples are going to be harvested, there's not a lot of UV, even though the sun might be shining. A great physicist actually gave me a bit of a heads up to this project, which helped problem solve a lot of exposure issues. The highest amount of UV is when your shadow is the shortest. When your shadow starts to extend your body length, you can start to double and triple your cyanotype exposure. So that's a great tip for all photographers out there trying to work with a cyanotype. So these were taking 20, 30 minutes. But what I was doing is I was looking at heritage apple trees that were growing very close to areas of forts. So this is a settler population that was coming into British Columbia through the Hudson Bay Company. And we're importing a certain food system into Coast Salish territories or into the Pacific Northwest in order to sustain the fort. And in some ways had not through proper communication channels understood that one of the key areas of traditional ecological knowledge coming from an indigenous population is the Pacific crabapple. And this is an example or a silhouette of it. And it's hard to say because I'm still trying to figure out the best vocabulary for it, but this is an indigenous tree to BC that is a type of wild apple. And it's the only wild apple that grows in here. And so this body of work that is looking at heritage apple trees is trying to document trees that are of a certain age and are likely as botanical specimens going to disappear. Mm-hmm. So this is the Pacific crabapple. And what you are experiencing in this is that you have an indigenous native species that sometimes landscape architects use in a decorative capacity, but the sense that this has a lot of inherent meaning, particularly to this Coast Salish community, goes overlooked. And so in a Salish community, this is both food, plant, medicine, family, and community. And yet sometimes it might be seen more in our streetscape as just a decorative plant. When you go out to areas that are part of the Metro Vancouver zone, such as Langley, which is associated also with Fort Langley, you come to areas that have the Derby Regional Park, there are these historical trees that are heralded that were planted by settlers as part of the colonization of British Columbia. And they represent certain species of plants or specimens that are also susceptible to disappear. So what I wanted to do with this series is actually create a double portrait, looking at the traditional ecological knowledge that's still well and alive, and look at the fact that we need to be pluralistic in photography and start to understand land systems, just like farming systems, through multiple lenses or definitions. And so this body of work starts to take on looking at these plants that were planted by settlers, but also looking at plants that have the same equal or if not longer age that were maintained by indigenous communities and still are. So I guess as much as I was looking at, you could say, the labels with the poplars that are in the National Galleries, I'm interested in also challenging museums with new didactics, dimensional photograph, broken photographic frame, Susan Sontag says everything's framed. Here's the Google frame where everything except for a little bit of the tripod base is available to the viewer and you can frame your own view. To this work that's a cyanotype that has very strong similar histories to the work that Anna Atkins was doing, but now can take on community and can also ask museums to start writing in this land acknowledgement in a much more proactive way, where you've got this binary that starts to exist. And obviously I'm not an indigenous artist, but how can I be respectful to that community? And so this is a project that is certainly started to unfold in recent. And you had mentioned also, other projects when we had conversations in the past. And this actually starts in Scotland. I'd always been interested, and it's again about how do you break photography? How do you make it malleable? And so if we can see photography in terms of a digital media as a pixel, where one item represents one color that together makes an entire image, what if the pixels were plants? And so I was very very fortunate with Keith Donnelly. We were longlisted for a project that was going to be done by Vastant developers in Edinburgh. It's a whole new housing and hotel complex. And I proposed that we would do some eco art murals. And effectively what they would be is living photographic plant imagery. And this would be accordingly planted in plazas and giving a certain green space and availability to residents who are higher up, so that they would have a vantage or a viewing corridor that also could give them a sense of some of the resources that are available and around them. And the kingfisher is a great icon going up and down the river canal system. Also, the plants themselves could act as pollinators to attract new wildlife into this urban corridor. So those are some of the things that are coming together.
Oh, that's fantastic. Well, thank you for sharing. And dare I say, all of the interesting ideas you just discussed, they also have this wonderful slippage in that they are producing aesthetically beautiful objects that you can be lured in by. And then when you think about the meaning and all the possible meanings, that's something quite beautiful to discover. I am realizing that we have gone on a little bit longer than we might have anticipated, but I just wanted to maybe sum it up before opening it up to others for their questions. I'm blown away by your expanded vocabulary and the notion of how to use photography of the public space, in the public space, and how we can make sense of the place that we are. That I also I'm interested in your, maybe you can think about this, you don't have to spend a lot of time on this, over time, do you think you might want to go back to some of the projects that you have encapsulated in a time bubble? For example, looking at EK modernism as an idea of documenting things before they are either regenerated or renovated. Thinking about farming, is that something that you might look at over time, how that changes? Or would you like to re-engage with Google Street View again? Or do you consider these projects in themselves finished, and then you might keep moving on as is in the project that you've just described? Or do you think we might see another EK modernism 2 or something?
It's a good question. And I think, at some point you think you have closure on a project, but what I've actually found instead is that you're ambassador for the project. So in a way, I will always represent the folks and the energy and the enthusiasm that was given by a community and bestowed upon me when I speak about those projects. So even though it's unlikely that I'll probably produce many more images of East Kilbride, I still, when I go through, I'm still, the shutter's still clicking away. And I have to say, and it's something that's a loss, is that in 2004 and 5 and onwards, this was really early digital photography. I couldn't afford film. So it was the first project where I had to go into a digital platform. And I tried to find as many ways to make that digital media speak more broadly to the public. And that's also why it could go online to form something like EK Newtown. But what I really love is I get correspondence a lot from, former residents of East Kilbride who ask, can they contribute to the archive? And what I find is that it's really fantastic that when a good project, continues, it at least gives, probably, as Isel, said at the beginning, gives people hope, gives them an opportunity to comment and to reclaim that space themselves.
Yeah.
So that's really, quite fantastic. Probably with the Lumsden biscuit, I thought I was finished with the photogram. I didn't think there was anything further I could do with it. And so it came as a shock that, wow, what if, an 80-year-old plant, which is sickly, its species may not exist, it will disappear because it's a botanical specimen and it's hard to maintain. What if the plant could produce its own portrait? And so these are bizarre projects in the sense that you have to wrap the plant almost like a Christo. They look phenomenal. I can't do this alone. Every project comes with assistance. So I have to say thanks to Ernie Davis for taking that on board. He's been helping me wrap plants. You have to also keep the public away because everyone thinks you're abusing these plants. I mean, it's bizarre when you're doing something that in some ways that doesn't have a consistent presence in its time. and you're trying to educate people about what you're doing, and you're not even quite sure what the outcomes are. And I think that's where innovation happens. Is it's sometimes a lot of failure, and sometimes there's some success.
Well, I think that is a wonderful place to leave it. Thank you so much. I think the ideas that you just shared with us really puts us in a good place for the welcome idea of going back out into the world soon and exploring and engaging with the things that are close by and far away, and finding similarities and studying them and asking why and who made this and what's it for and who's doing it and where does our food come from. Are we still talking about photography? I think so. I think it might be time to open for questions. Hi, Isolde.
Hi, that was fantastic. Thank you so much. We have kind of run a bit over time, and actually there's not a huge amount of questions, but there are quite a lot of comments. So I will just scroll through here and read some of the comments. I mean, you wrapped up talking about the biscuits. We've got a comment from Rachel Nordstrom. Hello, Rachel. Thank you for joining us. Rachel's one of the contributors to the book as well. She says, I just love these so much, talking about the biscuits, loving both the shortbread and the photogenic drawing. Heather Aird, wonderful. Just arrived, but we'll watch back from the beginning later. Nancy McLean, there's a couple of comments from her actually. Sorry, let me just find the longer one. So they're all coming in fast and thick now. What an incredible spirit of reconciliation to include the significant ethnobotanical species in your cyanotypes and note their importance in the history of Indigenous people. Miriam O'Connor, Sylvia, what a generous and interesting talk, thank you. Jenny Matthews, Jenny, I think of Half Moon camera work fame, so stimulating, thank you. From Jimmy Smith, excellent talk, Sylvia. Hang on, sorry, I've lost my scroll.
Oh, I know, I wanted to say right when you're, sorry, that just reminded me, I wanted to say something that in the idea of acknowledging and that you're working in different spaces, you are really, and I think I've said this to you before, you are reclaiming a lot of spaces on behalf of women artists that men have worked in. You are reclaiming spaces that urban planning is not a space that necessarily throws up a lot of female names. Architecture has a few examples of early architects. I think it's quite interesting that certainly when I remember your stories of intrepidly walking through Northern Ireland, photographing modernist churches by yourself with a camera and a foreign accent, these are all things that make you quite an incredible, intrepid female artist, as well as being an artist. And I just wanted to acknowledge that you are reclaiming a space for women artists. So thank you for that.
Oh, thank you. You know, I mean, you kind of, as I say, when I opened, you know, you just want to be a person, but yes, there's all sorts of ways it can be read. And there's no doubt, you know, being, as I say, educated in Vancouver, the Vancouver School of Art has had such a heavy presence. And so I always sort of, as an aside, you know, I don't mind working within landscape, but if you were to think about female photographers that are contemporaries, very few take it on board here. They will look at feminist issues. They will look at teenagehood. There's a very different way of looking at it. And so I love the fact that I can create a tableau that could be in similar vein to something like, you know, Rodney Graham, Stan Douglas, or Jeff Wall might undertake, and it will have a particular scale, but I can make something intimate that can move across a mobile phone. And you can have this tableau that you can hold in your own hand. So it's this act of generosity, but it's also, yes, if that comes to exhibition, it will have a scale that will be similar to that of a historical painting. But I think there's something interesting when you can shift across scales, economies of people and audience. And that's also been, you know, something different, which is potentially here, a lot of people will work with actors to portray a farmer or someone to come from a community to represent a certain trait. And I'd rather actually work with a community member to be, you know, to help inform the process fully and to be a collaborator. And, you know, if I have to say this as an end note, as I say, this love letter to Scotland, it also comes from, you know, seeing the work of someone like Ian Hamilton Finlay, who would name everybody that he'd worked with. And that was a real eye opener, because obviously Ian has a certain currency within Scotland, but his work is known less so in Canada. So coming across those bodies of work was really telling, because it was like, here's somebody who's doing something I'd never seen before.
There's actually quite a lot of questions coming in
now.
Gosh.
In
all truth, they're not simple questions either, and I've got a feeling we could be here all night. So I think, seeing as we have kind of gone on, what we usually try and do is, for questions that we haven't been able to get to, Sylvia, if you've got the time, come back to those maybe, because this is all recorded and it captures all the comments and the questions, so there can be some more dialogue happening through Facebook after the talk. A good kind of comment seems to end on is from Liz Wells, and she says, there's a really great essay by Dorothy Barton Scott titled Slow Photography in the book that I recommend. Liz is a contributor to the book, and I believe responsible for coming up with the title. Is that true?
Yes, definitely.
So perhaps appropriate for the last comment as we wrap up. So just want to say, can't thank you enough. Amazing talk. I think it's one that people are going to watch back several times, because there is so much food for thought in there. And yep, for everybody who's been watching, thank you so much for joining us, and do tune in again next week when we'll be back at the same time.